I'll just share my slides. Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
Lovely. I'll get started then. Okay, so thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here talking about homework and telework. My ideas are very much still developing, so I would be very interested in hearing your thoughts. So today I'll be discussing the emergence of telework, which is usually defined as working from home using computers, as well as telework activism in the 1990s, and what it meant for homework and homework activists. So the activism that developed around telework maintained a delicate balance between wanting to promote telework and paint it as the ideal form of work for the future, while also trying to support teleworkers who found that it had real downsides as well. Telework also offered a challenge to homework activists. Did teleworkers count as homeworkers? Should they be trying to include them as well? Activists were really divided over telework, and when they did include teleworkers, it was often in a relatively superficial way, which I'll be talking about a bit more towards the end of my talk. There was also some crossover between the two forms of activism. This was more that telework activists were interested in the work of homework activists rather than the opposite. So I'm also thinking about the larger significance of all of this, what it says about changing labour markets and labour activism at this time as flexible forms of work became more common and technology was having this real impact on how people worked. And also what it means in the present, as home-based work has become more common than ever before, thinking about the potential vulnerabilities or problems that all home-based workers might face regardless of their circumstances. So to give you an idea of the structure of what I'll be talking about today, I'll be starting by talking about the collaborative nature of my PhD as it's in partnership with the NGO Homeworkers Worldwide. So it really kind of crosses the boundary between academia and the voluntary and NGO sector, a lot like the Voluntary Action History Society itself. Then I'll be setting the scene a bit more, introducing homework and telework in a bit more detail. Then I'll be getting into the main focus of my paper today, telework. So my PhD project is on the history of activism around home-based work in Britain. While I initially thought that this would start with the 1970s and travel into the early 2000s, I've sort of ended up focusing more on the 1990s and early 2000s in the end. Also, just to let you know, some of the quality of these photos isn't the best. I was sort of in archives, not exactly expecting to use them for a presentation like this, but hopefully they'll be okay. So next, I'll tell you a little bit more about the nature of my project, which has really heavily influenced the path that I've taken through the PhD. So my PhD is a collaborative doctoral award funded by Open Oxford Cambridge, the doctoral partnership, and the project was specifically designed by my supervisors, Professor Helen McCarthy at Cambridge and Dr. Lucy Brill, who was until very recently the director of Homeworkers Worldwide. So Homeworkers Worldwide is a small NGO based in Leeds, which has been kind of a long-time hub of homework activism. Homeworkers Worldwide was created in the early 2000s, but it's part of this kind of much longer movement that I'll be talking about a bit more today. There's been a real continuity in the involvement of activists working on homework over the years, even as different organizations have kind of grown up and faded away. And because it's a collaborative project, I've been able to work with many activists who are involved in the events that I'm describing. This has been really especially useful in piecing together the bigger picture and filling in the gaps in the documents. So far, I've been able to conduct 7 oral histories with activists, and these have really aided my work a lot. So this is one of the benefits of this kind of collaborative project. So while Homeworkers Worldwide has been facilitating my research, I've really had complete freedom in my work. They haven't really tried to influence what I say or censor me in any way, which can, I guess, sometimes be a concern with this kind of project. I'm also happy to answer any questions you might have about the collaborative nature of the project. Most collaborative PhDs like this are done with much larger institutions like the National Trust and places like that. So this one I think is a bit unusual for the DTP. When I started, my supervisor, Lucy, was the only employee at Homeworkers Worldwide, and she's recently moved on to other things. So it's kind of more in a voluntary kind of position at the moment. So the continuity in the activists involved has also meant that as the lone survivor organisation, Homeworkers Worldwide has inherited the material held by many of the earlier organisations. Over time, as you can see on this slide here, Homeworkers Worldwide has built up an archive of more than 120 boxes of material, from campaign literature to internal discussion documents, reports, and even banners, videos, and samples of homework. It's this archive that makes up the main source base for my thesis. And it also helps to explain why my PhD has ended up focusing mainly on the 1990s. While there is some earlier material in the collection, most of it is from the 1990s and 2000s. And while there is a lot of Homeworkers Worldwide material in the collection, other key organisations include the main national organisation, the National Group on Homeworking, which was most active from the mid-90s until 2008, as well as the West Yorkshire Homeworking Unit, which was more active in the 80s and early 90s, and HomeNet, an international organisation that formed in the mid-1990s before it collapsed a few years later. As you can kind of tell from this picture, the archive itself is also quite unusual. It's currently housed in the home of one of the trustees, and part of my role in the collaboration has been to start to organise the archive, figuring out what's in it and doing some basic cataloguing. We're also working on finding the collection a more permanent home, probably at Feminist Archive North, which already has a prior donation from about 20 years ago. In the meantime, it's been quite nice to have a break from the short hours and strict rules of regular archives. I've also had a pretty special companion while I've been there. This is Hermione the cat. As you can see, she's very invested in making sure that I'm doing a thorough job in my work. So quite an unusual situation, but not a bad one. So while most of my PhD has been based around this archive, this particular chapter that I'm talking about today is quite different. I'm relying more on publications about telework, as well as the magazine of the main telework organisation. These sources are found in more conventional archives, including the British Library and the University of Cambridge's University Library. This means that I'm relying more on public outputs, so I don't really have the behind-the-scenes knowledge that I can get through the Homeworkers Worldwide archive and talking to activists. So here is a very brief overview of the chapters in my PhD. My overall aim has been to kind of trace the arc of this activism, looking at how it's shifted from local to national and then international activism, looking at the rise and fall of particular organisations, but also their campaigning methods and how the activism worked across different levels. I've ended up focusing on the 1990s as this kind of point of change in the movement as it began to look beyond just the UK. And this has been very much influenced by what's in the archive. So, manual homeworkers or outworkers who carry out paid work at home, usually piecework outsourced from factories, are amongst the lowest paid workers. You can see that kind of manual homework in these pictures here, making clothes, packing, and performing other supposedly low-skilled tasks, even trimming rubber like this homeworker on the right. They've long been an easy target for exploited employers. They're usually very poorly paid, many don't have adequate space or health and safety measures, and they sometimes work with materials that damage their health. And all of this is done in the home around the other demands of family life. In the mid-1990s, it was estimated that there were 1 million homeworkers in the UK alone. Homeworkers are almost always women, many of them mothers or with other caring responsibilities, and they choose homework because it fits around their other commitments. Many homeworkers come from migrant and minority communities. The exact proportions of women from different backgrounds has always been really hard to gauge because of how invisible homework is. But around half of homeworkers in the UK in the 1990s came from migrant communities, most of them from South Asia. So homework had drawn attention in the early part of the 20th century, but it ended up kind of fading from view after the Trade Board Act of 1909 set minimum wages in certain industries. The homework cause was taken up again in the 1970s and 80s by local grassroots organisations and activists concentrated particularly in the north of England, especially West Yorkshire. This was a period when globalisation was escalating and supply chains became more international and drawn out. Homework was cheaper than traditional labour and could be completed more quickly than factory labour on the other side of the world. So it started to be used more in the UK as factories here closed. Since the 70s, there have been a range of organisations working to help homeworkers, from the local through to national and international levels. By the mid-1990s, this developed into a national and eventually international movement. It's important to note that homework activists weren't seeking to get rid of homework. as many women really did want to be able to work from their homes. Rather, they wanted it to be better regulated and less exploitative. So there were many barriers for activists that were trying to work with homeworkers. As you can see in this cartoon from The Big Issue, there were many demands on their time. This particular example focuses on homeworkers who made Christmas crackers. There was a really big campaign in the late 90s targeting employers who paid homeworkers just a few pence to make the crackers. For women in these circumstances, they often had pretty limited time to engage with homework organisations, so that was a real barrier. Even before that, though, just locating homeworkers in the first place was a challenge. It was difficult to know which companies were employing homeworkers. Most companies refused to discuss it, or they actively hid their homeworkers because they were working informally. Then many homeworkers didn't conceptualize what they did as real work, seeing it as just something they did for a bit of extra money around their household responsibilities, even though it was often really essential for household finances. Homework was also extremely insecure. Homeworkers that complained about their conditions would just lose their work, and there were very few options for redress. This was compounded by the fact that homeworkers were often treated as self-employed, even though many worked consistently for the same employer for years at a time. This was not helped by the minimal regulation that existed in this area. Before the introduction of the minimum wage in 1998, homeworkers could go to industrial tribunals, but they had to prove that they were employed rather than self-employed. And this was usually impossible given that they rarely had contracts or any other kind of paperwork. The minimum wage did change this, making employers instead prove that they were not employees. But the kind of long and draining nature of going through the tribunal process meant that very few homeworkers pursued this option. Even homeworkers that successfully fought their cases could end up just losing their work. In a similar vein, homeworkers were skeptical about formal organisation, such as in trade unions. Again, employers treated them as disposable, so homeworkers would just lose their work if they seemed interested in organising. Additionally, because they were so hard to find, it was almost impossible to mount the kind of collective action that many union methods relied upon. Many were also uncertain about the legal status of their work, given that it was so often informal, and those that received benefits were worried about losing them if the government found out that they worked. On top of all of this, over time, the homework movement professionalised, with fewer activists having direct experience of homework themselves, putting up yet another barrier between activists and workers. So now that we have a sense of who home workers are, let's have a bit of a chat about teleworkers. So teleworkers, on the other hand, were often perceived as entirely different to home workers. As you can see here, there was a strong kind of cultural perception of them as white-collar men well established in their careers. On the surface then, they had very little in common with more traditional manual home workers. But as we shall see, this was not necessarily the case. So this brings us to the main subject of today's seminar, the development of telework activism and its relationship to homework activism in the UK during the 90s. So as I said earlier, telework is essentially working from home using computers, but it can also be done with telephones. Telework had its roots in utopian visions of a technological future in the 1970s and 1980s. Influential writers like American futurologist Alvin Toffler predicted how labour would change over the coming decades with the advancement of computer technology. As one of the key thinkers behind the concept, Toffler's work is worth talking about in a little more depth, as it introduced many of the themes that would become really core to the ideal of telework. Toffler predicted that, quote, literally millions of jobs would be shifted into the home, a return to cottage industry on a new, higher electronic basis. He conceptualized this as a return to a pre-industrial age, where families and communities laboured in their own homes. Moreover, the decentralisation of jobs that were currently concentrated in city centres would lead to less time and fuel wasted on commuting, reduce pollution, and alleviate social concerns that the nuclear family was, quote, clearly in crisis. So also just for context, this is Teleworker magazine on the slide here, the publication of the main telework organisation that I'll be talking about today. So despite the longer history about the possibilities of telework, widespread telework was only really possible in the 1990s as home PCs became more accessible. So it seemed that telework would revolutionise labour. It appeared to offer advantages for everyone. Workers could avoid draining commutes and have more time with their families. Employers wouldn't have to rent costly inner city offices, and it would increase productivity as employees wouldn't be able to waste time just socializing in the workplace. It would also help save the environment with fewer commuters on the roads. These conversations had a strongly rural dimension. Many politicians and advocates thought that this would revitalise the countryside, long drained by industrialisation as young people moved to cities. As you can see here in the main headline in this copy of Teleworker, telework was advertised as this kind of idyllic rural life. It says, "This man works from the comfort of his rural home. Could you? Find out how inside." So in a way, it seemed that these new technologies could actually revive these older forms of rural community life. A lot of these conversations about home-based work are more familiar now to us, with the widespread shift to home-based working during the pandemic. But at the time, these were really novel, innovative, and almost utopian ideas. In Britain, the shift to white-collar and service-based work and the corresponding decline of British industry meant that the labour market prioritised new kinds of work, with technological development a key factor in generating new jobs and rendering others redundant. As part of this shift, flexible forms of labour, including part-time and casual work, became more common. Successive British governments were also keen on telework. They wanted to promote flexible work as a big part of the labour market, and telework offered so many opportunities for different kinds of flexible work, from part-time or flexible hours to hiring workers only when they were needed. Margaret Thatcher's government was the first to promote this kind of work, and it continued under John Major and Tony Blair. However, the early utopian vision of telework began to meet reality as it became more common across the 1990s. While researchers had always raised concerns about the potential limitations of telework, these became increasingly apparent as more companies introduced it in pilot schemes and ad hoc arrangements with trusted staff. These early arrangements often focused on relatively senior staff in professional and managerial roles, and this may be part of how teleworkers came to be seen as mostly men in these high-status, well-paid roles. However, the truth was a lot more complicated than this. For example, women were often in these kind of high-powered roles as well. There were women who were able to be in kind of successful, high-status telework roles from their homes. And while many teleworkers were well-paid professionals, there was also an expansion in more low-status positions, as teleworkers were used to do administration, like data entry and call center roles. And it was usually women doing these kinds of lower status work. And like manual homework, it was particularly appealing for women who had caring responsibilities. It could also be ideal for people with disabilities, especially as more adaptable equipment became available. So while there was a greater complexity behind the stereotype of teleworkers as just these kind of professional, well-paid men, research did show that stereotypes about teleworkers being white were actually more accurate. Most teleworkers at this time were white. Research also demonstrated that managers were reluctant to allow telework, fearing that they would lose control over their workers. It could also be damaging for teleworkers themselves, who could feel isolated and out of touch with the office. And research did show that it was harder for teleworkers to advance in their careers. It's likely because of these reasons that telework grew more slowly than anticipated through the 1990s. It's quite difficult to measure telework, as many worked only partly at home, and it was often categorized along with homework and other forms of off-site labor. But labour force surveys did show a steady increase in telework, although it was quite difficult to gauge exactly. Teleworkers made up about 4% of the working population in 1997, or more than 900,000. And between 1997 and 2003 alone, the number of teleworkers doubled to more than 2 million people, over 7.5% of the workforce. So there was this kind of definite upward trajectory in the number of teleworkers, but it was nowhere near on the kind of massive revolutionary scale anticipated earlier. So the Telecottage Association, later the Telework Association, or the TCA, was the key organisation that emerged to support teleworkers and promote telework. It began in 1993 after a series of conferences brought together interested individuals. Their focus was on both telework and telecottages. Here I'm focusing on the telework side of their advocacy, but I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about telecottages. The key figures behind the TCA were overwhelmingly white, professional, and middle class, and most of them were men. This, for example, was the very first chair of the TCA, Ashley Dobbs, who was a property developer who was particularly keen on telecottages and building purpose-built communities for teleworkers. This kind of lack of diversity wasn't really acknowledged in the TCA from what I can see. And this stood in quite stark contrast to homework activism, which was almost entirely female, with some, albeit quite limited, ethnic and class diversity. And homework activists were always much more concerned about the lack of diversity in their ranks and really keen to kind of appeal to a wide range of people, whereas the TCA didn't seem to have that kind of awareness. After just the first year, the TCA claimed to have several thousand members, from individuals to local authorities and major companies. The Teleworking Handbook, produced by the TCA in 1996, is really revealing of the idealism that underpinned its early evangelical approach. Teleworking, according to the handbook, began when, quote, a few far-sighted and intrepid pioneers insisted that this was the way of future work. This began, quote, a revolution, one in which the UK and Ireland are leading pioneers in Europe. The advantages to the individual of freedom, of control, of personal fulfillment are so immense that it is amazing more people haven't cottoned on to them yet. And this kind of real optimism ran through much of the TCA's work. At the same time, the TCA walked a kind of fine line in promoting telework through lobbying and raising public awareness, while also acknowledging that telework could make workers vulnerable to exploitation and poor working conditions, as I'll be discussing more in a moment. As I said, the TCA's magazine, Teleworker, is the main source base that I'm using for this paper. As you can see, it was kind of a glossy, well-funded magazine. 40,000 copies were printed of just the first issue, so it was aiming to speak to teleworkers, but also a much wider audience of potential teleworkers and companies, really trying to bring it into the mainstream as an acceptable form of labour. So the TCA's key purpose was to promote telework. It targeted politicians, the government, businesses, and individual workers in pursuit of this mission. In 1996, the TCA identified itself as, quote, a lobbying force that highlights issues affecting teleworking. As you can see here, by 1997, on the left here, each issue of Teleworker magazine opened with an explanation that the TCA, quote, exists to support teleworkers and telecottages and to promote and lobby on their behalf. Among the benefits for its members were news on what new work opportunities, local groups, and an advice service. So this kind of tension between the promotion of telework and support for its members was really, therefore, just kind of inherent in the way that the TCA was organised from the beginning. As you can see here on the right, the TCA also received funding from a variety of sources, particularly private companies like Lloyd's, Hewlett-Packard, Apple, and BT. This reliance on sponsorship quite likely influenced its ongoing focus on promoting telework, which sometimes did end up taking precedence over its support role. Local authorities and development organisations were also interested in telework, as was the national government. Teleworker documented many cases of local authorities introducing telework for their staff. As you can see here, this is a very typical example. And many telework initiatives were also successful in gaining government funding. There was also considerable European interest in telework. Many British initiatives were funded by European bodies, including the European Commission. So how did the TCA promote telework? In general, the TCA felt that the government actually wasn't doing enough at the national level to promote the wide uptake of telework. Consequently, lobbying the national government was a really major strategy for the TCA, and it did this by communicating directly with politicians. It formed a kind of pressure group, the UK Telework platform, with other interested organisations. Together, they put on an exhibition about telework at the House of Commons in 1998. The platform also tried to gain momentum for a cross-party interest group on telework, hoping that it would work with government departments to, quote, get teleworking to be an integral part of their policy. It didn't succeed in this instance, but it didn't mean that the TCA was giving up. In 1999, it seemed that there was finally a breakthrough. In what the TCA deemed an official seal of approval, it was selected as one of the hosts of Telework 2000, the 7th European Assembly on Teleworking. This was the biggest telework event in Europe, and the TCA partnered with BT, the Department of Trade and Industry, and the European Commission in organising the event. Prime Minister Tony Blair, as you can see here, sent a letter in support of London's hosting of the conference, outlining his, quote, simple vision for teleworking. He said that he wanted to open lines of communication and collaboration and make information accessible. He recognised that this came with challenges, however, such as maintaining competitiveness, modernising government, and, quote, how do we ensure that all members of society are taken along at the same pace? This final point really indicated the inequality in access to technology and training that could create class differences in access to telework. While this was all a little bit vague, it appeared to demonstrate that the Labour government was taking telework seriously. Similarly, Minister for Small Business and E-commerce, Patricia Hewitt, described how telework was undoubtedly one of the big changes that is going to come in the new century, inviting readers of Teleworker to the conference to learn about the benefits that it brings to business, individuals, and to the community alike. More than 500 people attended the conference, so it was seen as a major success for the TCA, even though it didn't immediately lead to major changes in policy. So the government did support the development of telework, even if progress was slower than the TCA would have liked. The TCA's attitude towards regulations shows some of the tensions in its mission to promote telework while also caring for the welfare of its members. The TCA's flagship publication that I mentioned before, the Teleworking Handbook, was first published in 1996 with several further editions, and it addressed the question of whether telework should be more regulated, as at this time there were no specific government regulations that addressed telework. The authors wrote that, as you can see here, if all the laws which could be applied to teleworking were enforced absolutely rigorously, there would be very little telework. This not only suggested that the TCA did not want specific regulation of telework, but also that existing general employment protections shouldn't be enforced. Moreover, the handbook claimed that health and safety authorities have draconian powers of inspection and enforcement. This really demonstrates a refusal to recognise that teleworkers could even be at risk of exploitation or poor working conditions. Proponents often emphasised how telework offered freedom and flexibility, so regulation really seemed to undermine these goals. This assumption that telework did not need to be regulated reflected a class bias that was inherent in understandings of telework and homework. White-collar teleworkers, it was presumed, did not require the same protections as working-class, unskilled homeworkers. In fact, research actually showed that the two were not as far apart as the stereotypes indicated. Indeed, many teleworkers were vulnerable as their employers sought to cut costs by moving their employment status from employee to self-employed, just as happened to homeworkers. This meant that they lost many of the protections that were provided under employment law. Over time, the TCA's position on telework seems to have shifted. Telework regulation, seems to have shifted. By 2003, in discussing how it saw its role, the TCA described how it wanted to continue, quote, lobbying and encouraging changes in legislation to help home workers avoid some of the problems involved in their work. It's not easy to tell why this attitude towards regulation changed, but it helps to see it in the broader context of the TCA's support for its members. From the beginning, the TCA regularly warned its members about the risk of scams, which promised work if they paid a fee first. Later, it also paid attention to health and safety and potential tax issues, keeping an eye on the latest regulations, but this time to consider how they could help teleworkers. As you can see here, they also encouraged individual teleworkers to come to them with their problems. This is Alan Denby, another of the key leaders of the TCA. And again, you can see this very idyllic kind of middle-class version of telework in the way that he is depicted here. The TCA also addressed the problem of overheads. Many employers failed to cover all of the costs incurred with working from home. This particular article in Teleworker suggested that this may be, quote, symptomatic of a corporate attitude recently expressed to teleworker, which implied that full compensation was unnecessary because for teleworkers, the personal benefits are so high. The kind of disapproving tone of this article illustrates that the TCA wasn't solely on the side of employers and the promotion of telework. It really did have an interest in helping workers too. The article went on to outline trade union positions in support of telework. Generally, unions were really keen to help support teleworkers, a real departure from their approach to home workers, who were almost universally left behind by unions. Similarly, when a TCA member reported problems that she had with a phone line, the magazine reminded members that, quote, they can contact us to take up issues of this nature on their behalf. Over time, this became more of a priority. By 2002, the TCA board, quote, agreed to spend more time trying to improve the lot of those working from home. The TCA also began to recognise that not all teleworkers were well-paid professionals. While Teleworker continued to carry articles like this on how to build a home office in your garden and the latest fancy, new, expensive, high-tech equipment, it also wrote about companies that were using teleworkers for call centre services and other low-paid administrative work, mainly performed by women. You can see here how Scottish Widows recruited teleworkers as call centre workers, and they actually did that through a call out in the magazine. Unfortunately, like many attempts by established companies to hire teleworking teams at this time, within a couple of years, they were brought back into the office. The TCA was also beginning to recognise other problems with low-paid work. In an article in a 1997-1998 edition of Teleworker, regular writer Andrew Bibby also wrote about a newly emerging problem that had potentially serious consequences for these new types of low-status telework: overseas outsourcing. Already, Bibby found data entry and call centre roles were moving overseas. This was a really close relation of what had been happening to manual homework for decades. As labour prices in the UK climbed, particularly once the minimum wage was introduced in 1998, companies were looking overseas to reduce their costs. Once again, it turned out that teleworkers and homeworkers had more in common than it seemed on the surface. So this is where homework activists come back into the picture. In seeking to aid its members, the TCA regularly drew upon information and materials that were distributed by homeworking organisations, particularly the National Group on Homeworking. You can see here in this 1999 article how Teleworker produced, how Teleworker included the National Group's research on the implementation of the national minimum wage, providing contact details for the National Group for teleworkers who may be interested in participating in their study on the effects of the minimum wage. The following year, a member of the TCA told readers about a suspicious newspaper advertisement that a member had reported to them. The advertisement instructed interested homeworkers to call a premium number to get work. The TCA, feeling that this broke the basic principle advised by the National Group on Homeworking and others never to pay money to find work, contacted both the company and Shropshire Trading Standards on behalf of the member. The National Group was also paying close attention to issues like scams and health and safety, and was constantly lobbying the government to do more to assist home-based workers. So Teleworker magazine frequently directed readers to call the National Group on Homework if they were facing problems. So the TCA did recognise that there was this kind of overlap between telework and homework, that they could share the same vulnerabilities because of their positionality. This could include isolation, the potential for exploitation, and poor working conditions. It's really striking how often the TCA began to refer to the National Group at this time, seeing it as a kind of partner organisation that was working with the same constituency. So while the TCA did spend much of its time promoting telework, it also began to acknowledge the problems that came with adopting it on a widespread basis. It became clear that there was this real overlap with manual homeworkers, and it was willing to work in concert with homework activists, drawing on their resources for their members. However, this did not necessarily go both ways. As we'll see in a moment, homework activists very rarely mention the TCA, but internally they were considering what exactly telework meant for their own activism. But before we get to that, there's one more thing I want to talk about, and that's this broader linguistic shift that was underway that had consequences for our broader understanding of the terms homework and home-based work. So while the TCA recognised the overlap between homework and telework, It was also contributing to a broader discursive shift taking place at this time, as manual homework was slowly pushed out of the popular understanding of homework to be replaced by telework. Until this point, the word homework referred most often to manual homework, but the appearance of telework meant that the meaning of the term was being reinterpreted. For many conservative politicians at this time, among others, telework had already largely replaced manual homework. For them, manual homework was in terminal decline. This view was shared by Alan Denby, who I mentioned before, one of the TCA's main leaders, who wrote in 2001 that telework was growing and, quote, at the same time, and I believe this ought to be seen as a good thing, the more traditional homeworking with its image of exploitation and low pay is in decline. Thus, while the TCA was drawing on the national group's resources, at least one member of its leadership team failed to sympathise with the national group's goal to regulate rather than eliminate manual homework. Over time, manual homework became less visible in conversations about home-based work. Now, homework is popularly understood in the way that we usually use it as referring just to telework. And the roots of this discursive shift were visible in the 1990s, as commentators in Teleworker and elsewhere referred to homework when they really meant telework. As you can see here in this article in Mobile Enterprise magazine, which enthused that homeworking is taking off, encouraged by cheap broadband and new legislation, and described how, quote, the move to a homeworking culture would benefit workers. So already they were using the term homeworking when they really were talking about telework. Similarly, the 2003 report, Time to Go Home, Embracing the Homeworking Revolution, published by think tank The Work Foundation, used the term homeworking throughout the report to refer to telework. The report justified this usage on the basis that it was, quote, an increasingly common term that encompassed, quote, office-type work carried out by employees working from or at home. It added that advances in technology have meant that most homeworking today is teleworking. Acknowledging that it was discussing telework specifically, despite referring to it as homework, the writers explained that, quote, we generally use the term homeworking because in practical terms, teleworking sounds dated. Finally, recognizing the existence of another kind of homework, it said that, quote, this report is not seeking to address traditional manual homeworking, as this is a separate, important subject in itself, though now representing a declining proportion of the total who work from home. This kind of colonization of the term really demonstrated the realization of the concerns of some homework activists. The evolution of the term away from its roots in manual homework served to kind of further erase the continued existence of manual homework, which, while perhaps a smaller percentage of the workforce, continued to exist. With the disappearance of the national group and local projects since the early 2000s, there's been pretty limited research on British homeworkers. And this can make it appear as if this form of work has disappeared, when it's more likely a lack of research that's actually led to this invisibility. So now that we've discussed how telework organisations understood homework, what did homework organisations make of telework? Organisations that campaigned for home workers had a complicated relationship with telework. They regularly highlighted the similarities between the two, but never fully incorporated teleworkers into their efforts. This meant that while teleworkers were often included in campaign literature, this very rarely translated into grassroots work with teleworkers. This list of homeworking jobs produced in the 1990s shows how teleworkers could be included in conceptions of homeworking. Alongside jobs like assembling ballpoint pens and making academic gowns and ironing, inputting data is included here as one job that homeworkers did. Some activists, including those in other parts of Europe like Germany and Madeira, preferred to explicitly exclude teleworkers in their definitions of homework. In an oral history I conducted recently, an activist talked about Jane Tate, who was the key figure in homework activism in the UK. They said that telework, quote, was not how Jane saw homework. She'd talk about the poorest homeworkers, really outworkers doing industrial things. So for some activists, telework didn't really have a place at all in how they conceptualized homework, despite the shared problems that they could face. However, most activists, including Tate, were willing to include them, at least in some form. For some activists, both in the UK and in the international movement, only certain home workers should be considered alongside manual home workers. only certain teleworkers should be included alongside manual homeworkers. In the mid-1990s, during conversations about the International Labour Organization's Convention on Homework, which passed in 1996, these activists coined the term telehomeworker to refer to low status and low paid teleworkers, arguing that these workers, but not other teleworkers, should come under the banner of homework. Research by British activists at this time generally failed to include teleworkers, saying that while they did consider telehome workers to come under their remit, they were not part of their studies. For instance, this report on supply chains in the UK said that, quote, "We did not consciously exclude telehome workers, but find that people doing clerical work or working with a computer are a minority of those contacting local projects." So because teleworkers were not reaching out to homework organisations themselves, they were often neglected by activists. Local British homework organisations also told the National Group in a 1994 survey that they weren't interested in telework. Only one said that it wanted to take up the telework issue. So context is really significant here. Most local projects were really struggling to survive, so they probably didn't have the resources to expand their work. At the same time, many activists in the UK, including Jane Tate, were becoming more interested in manual homework in the global south, so teleworkers in the UK were just not really a priority for them. Where activists in the UK did include telework in their campaigning, it was more often used as a tool to draw attention back to manual homework. For example, in 2000, Linda Devereux, the director of the National Group, delivered a seminar in Cambridge on teleworking and homeworking. She acknowledged the potential benefits of telework, but warned that potential undesirable side effects and impact on the home-based workers are rarely looked at or addressed. Teleworkers and homeworkers, she argued, face the same problems, including illegitimate self-employment. She pointed to the fallacy of the differentiation between old and new forms of homework, saying, "We must be aware that old practices are easily adopted to the detriment of workers." In this way, telework could also become a kind of tool for activists to bring attention to the less glamorous side of home-based work and shine the light back onto homework. However, while homework activists often put the two in the same category, in general, homework organisations like the National Group worked with very few telehome workers, as they called them. In 2001, it reported that a small number of the National Group's home worker contacts are involved in low discretion ICT work, such as data input or clerical functions. In its examination of the impact of the minimum wage, 15% of the National Group's participants were teleworkers. So while the available evidence suggests that the National Group was ultimately talking about telework without substantial direct action with teleworkers, Linda Devereux, the director, saw this from a different perspective, pointing out that teleworkers had their own organisations, like the TCA. When asked about including teleworkers, she told me, "We weren't opposed to it. We would have included them if they were in touch with us." So it was this kind of separation that hadn't been overcome for Devereux. Home workers were the priority, while teleworkers were only part of their jurisdiction if they approached homework activists first. So while telework seemed to be this utopian new form of work in the 1990s, in many ways, it was not necessarily so different to manual home workers, as workers faced very similar risks like isolation and exploitation. The TCA dealt with this complexity by publicly promoting telework, while also acknowledging these risks and supporting its members, particularly through its magazine. It also recognised how the problems of teleworkers closely resembled those of other home-based workers and was willing to direct members to the National Group on homeworking. On the other side of this, the homework activists were more divided about how to approach telework. And where they directly addressed telework, it was more often a kind of lip service or using it to bring attention to their core constituency of home workers. Others had no interest in including them at all. This was all taking place in a wider picture of the changing labour market, as manual homework did decline as more work moved overseas and telework slowly became more common. Eventually, this would mean that homework became almost forgotten in discussions of home-based work. But this time, the 1990s demonstrates how activists on both sides were trying to understand what this new form of work meant, who deserved or needed help, and whether it was their responsibility to take up the cause. Thank you.